The story you are about to hear is not comfortable. It is not fast, and it is not meant to be consumed and forgotten. This is a story that forces a pause. Because in the United States of America, a nation built on law, liberty, and justice, the government still carries the power to end a human life. And when that power is exercised, it does not happen in secret. It happens in the name of the people. Tonight, we begin a documentary series that walks directly into that reality. One case at a time, one life at a time. No rumors, no exaggeration, no shortcuts. This episode begins with a name that resurfaced decades after a crime, decades after a sentence, and decades after a jury made a decision that could never be reversed. Marion Bowman Jr., before he became a headline, before he became an inmate number, before his name appeared on an execution schedule, he existed within a system and a country that was already divided over what justice truly means. To understand this story, you must first understand the moment in American history in which it unfolded. The modern death penalty in the United States was reinstated in 1976 after the Supreme Court ruled that revised capital punishment laws could proceed under strict guidelines. From that moment forward, executions were no longer routine. They became rare, contested, and deeply scrutinized. Every death sentence passed through years, sometimes decades, of appeals, legal reviews, and public debate. By the time Marion Bowman Jr.'s case returned to public attention, the death penalty itself had become one of the most polarizing issues in the nation. Some states had abolished it entirely. Others paused executions indefinitely. A few, including South Carolina, stood firm in their position that capital punishment remained a necessary tool of justice. South Carolina's relationship with the death penalty is complex. The state has a long history shaped by violent crime, harsh sentencing laws, and an evolving legal system attempting to balance punishment with constitutional rights. For years, executions in the state stalled due to legal challenges, supply issues related to lethal injection drugs, and questions surrounding execution methods. Death row inmates waited. Victims' families waited. The courts waited. Time stretched on. In this environment, cases like Marion Bowman Jr.'s did not fade away, they aged. Evidence grew old. Witnesses disappeared. Memories blurred. Yet the sentence remained unchanged, preserved in court documents and upheld through layers of legal review. For the public, death penalty cases often feel distant until the final moments approach. Trials are reported, verdicts are delivered, and then silence follows, sometimes for decades. When an execution date is finally set, the story returns suddenly, often without context, stripped down to a few lines of text scrolling across a screen. But justice does not exist in fragments. Behind every execution is a long road, a life lived before the crime, a trial shaped by the laws of its time, and years spent inside a system designed to punish while claiming to preserve fairness. This documentary does not ask you to take a side. It does not ask you to agree or disagree with the sentence. It asks only that you understand the full story. Because Marion Bowman Jr.'s case is not only about what happened, it is about how America responds when it believes the ultimate punishment is justified. It is about the weight carried by jurors who make irreversible decisions. It is about the courts that uphold those decisions. And it is about a society that must live with the consequences. As this story unfolds, we will move carefully and deliberately. We will examine the circumstances that shaped Marion Bowman Jr.'s early life, the choices that led him into the criminal justice system, and the legal process that ultimately sealed his fate. We will explore the long years between conviction and execution, years filled with appeals, delays, and unanswered questions. And when the story reaches its final chapter, we will confront the moments the law considers its conclusion, the final meal, the final words, and the final act carried out by the state. But that moment does not come yet, because every ending is shaped by a beginning. And before Marion Bowman Jr. became a symbol in the national debate over capital punishment, he was a young man growing up within a specific world, influenced by family environment and circumstances that cannot be ignored if the story is to be told honestly. This is not a story told to glorify crime. It is not a story told to erase responsibility. It is a story told to document reality. The story of Marion Bowman Jr. doesn't begin in a courtroom or on a prison bench. It starts long before the headlines, long before the police reports, and long before the sentence that would one day define his life in the eyes of the public. To truly understand Marion Bowman Jr., we have to go back. We have to understand the environment that shaped him, the social, economic, and personal circumstances that quietly steered the course of his life, long before the tragedy that would follow. Marion Bowman Jr. was born in South Carolina, a state rich with history, yet burdened by complex social challenges. The community he was born into was a place of deep paradoxes. You had pride and resilience living right alongside systemic inequality and economic hardship. From the very beginning, his world was one where opportunity and struggle existed side by side, and the paths available to a young person were often shaped more by circumstance than by choice. Growing up, Marion's family life was complicated. Like so many households, it was a mix of support, tension, and the everyday reality of just trying to get by. Family members remember a home where discipline and high expectations were present, but so was affection. Yet, the constant pressures from the outside world often overshadowed any sense of stability. Economic struggles meant resources were always tight, and a young Marion quickly learned that the world beyond his front door could be an unforgiving place. School, friendships, and the dynamics of his neighborhood all played a huge role in shaping his view of the world. These experiences taught him to be resilient, but they also exposed him to environments that were, at times, harsh and unforgiving. Education was a challenging path for Marion. Teachers and classmates remember him as a kid who was clearly intelligent and curious, but he was also easily distracted, sometimes withdrawn, and occasionally reacted strongly to situations he couldn't control. In communities like his, the line between normal youthful mischief and behavior that could get you in trouble with the law was incredibly thin. Many young people found themselves under a microscope for actions that might have gone completely unnoticed in a different neighborhood. Marion navigated this world the best he could, trying to balance moments of promise with the tough reality of growing up in a place filled with social and economic tension. Friendships were a major part of his teenage years. In some accounts, Marion found a sense of camaraderie and belonging with friends who were facing the same kinds of challenges he was. These connections were formative, helping to shape his early sense of identity and loyalty. But, as is often the case in communities dealing with systemic problems, not all influences were positive. Choices made in his youth, combined with his circumstances, started to push against societal boundaries. This created a complex web of decisions, pressures, and consequences that would eventually follow him into adulthood. Beyond his neighborhood and school, Marion was also shaped by the larger society around him. South Carolina, like much of the American South, has a history deeply tangled with the legacies of segregation, economic inequality, and racial disparities. These historical realities directly affected access to good education, job opportunities, and community support systems. For Marion, and for countless others like him, growing up meant trying to navigate a world where opportunities were not handed out equally, and where systemic barriers could hold you back, no matter how talented or determined you were. Family stories, memories from people who knew him, and official records all suggest that Marion had moments of real aspiration, glimpses of what he could have become under different circumstances. He had hobbies, interests, and the same ordinary ambitions that most young people have. But these moments always existed alongside a constant undercurrent of tension, a tension between the opportunities that were available and the massive challenges imposed by his environment, his circumstances, and his own personal choices. As Marion moved from his teens into young adulthood, certain patterns began to take root. The decisions he made in school, his interactions with his friends, and how he responded to the pressures around him. All of these became formative. These weren't single, dramatic events that led directly to a criminal sentence. Instead, they were a series of critical moments that shaped the person who would one day stand before the legal system in the most serious way imaginable. Understanding these early influences is absolutely crucial if we're going to tell his story honestly. It shows us that no life happens in a vacuum, separate from the society it unfolds in. Marion's family, though not perfect, provided him with both anchors and pressures. His relationships with his parents, siblings, and extended family were complex, sometimes supportive, sometimes strained. These relationships were critical in shaping his identity, his values, and how he reacted to challenges. For any young person, and especially for Marion, family dynamics taught lessons in responsibility, accountability, and consequence. Lessons that would later tragically collide with the choices that led to his conviction. By the time he reached adulthood, Marion Bowman Jr. was a product of many overlapping realities. A personal environment shaped by family and friends, a neighborhood influenced by socioeconomic struggles, and a broader society defined by historical inequities and modern-day pressures. He carried within him both potential and vulnerability, both resilience and risk. This combination, while common in many lives, would in his case intersect with circumstances that set him on a collision course with the law. It is essential to understand that this background is not meant to excuse or justify what happened later. Rather, it provides the context we need for a full understanding of the person before he became a headline. Marion Bowman Jr.'s early life shows us the complexity of human development, the powerful influence of circumstance, and the intricate dance between choice and environment. It demonstrates how social, familial, and personal factors all weave together to shape a person's path, sometimes in ways that society only recognizes after the consequences have fully unfolded. As this story moves forward, these early experiences set the stage for the events that would follow, the choices that led to legal intervention, the trial that would capture national attention, and the sentence that would ultimately define his place in history. To tell his story without this foundation would be to tell it incompletely, ignoring the forces and realities that exist long before the law and punishment are ever applied. Understanding Marion Bowman Jr. requires us to acknowledge this full spectrum: the young boy growing up in South Carolina, the adolescent trying to navigate friendships and pressures, and the young adult making his way in a world of choices constrained by circumstance. Each layer of his life gives us insight into the factors that shaped him and underscores the importance of context in any conversation about justice, accountability, and consequence. We're now at the threshold of the events that would draw Marion Bowman Jr. into the American legal system. What follows is a careful, factual exploration of those events, the choices, the consequences, and the trial, all told without sensationalism, but with the depth needed for a story this important. As Marion Bowman Jr.'s life transitioned into adulthood, the choices he made would intersect with the law in a way that defined his place in American legal history. To tell this story responsibly, it's crucial to examine the events factually, without sensationalizing them, and to focus on the sequence of actions, the investigation, and the legal process that followed. The story isn't just about a single act, but about the system that responded, the evidence that was collected, and the courtroom decisions that ultimately led to a death sentence. In the early 1990s, Marion Bowman Jr. became involved in circumstances that drew the attention of law enforcement in South Carolina. While the precise details of the incident are sensitive, public records show that Bowman was charged with a serious violent crime that resulted in the death of another person. The severity of the alleged crime meant that state authorities treated the investigation with the utmost seriousness. They deployed detectives, forensic experts, and legal teams to ensure that every aspect of the case was meticulously examined. Law enforcement reports indicate that the initial investigation focused on gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the sequence of events. Forensic evidence played a pivotal role in building the case against Bowman, as did witness testimony and records of his movements at the time of the incident. Authorities faced the challenge of assembling a case that could withstand intense legal scrutiny. Death penalty prosecutions require a higher burden of proof and meticulous attention to detail. Every fact, every statement, and every piece of evidence was subject to rigorous analysis, because the consequences of error in a capital case are irreversible. Witnesses described Marion Bowman Jr. as cooperative during the early stages of questioning, but their recollections varied, reflecting the complexities of human memory and perception. Some accounts painted a picture of a person who acted under pressure, while others suggested premeditation or intent. The prosecution sought to establish a clear chain of responsibility, emphasizing the seriousness of the offense and its impact on the victim and the community. The defense, meanwhile, highlighted inconsistencies in witness statements, procedural questions, and mitigating factors in Bowman's background. They argued that context and circumstance should be considered when assessing culpability. As the case moved toward trial, the legal proceedings became a critical arena where every detail mattered. Pretrial motions addressed questions about the admissibility of evidence, potential biases in jury selection, and procedural fairness. The defense filed motions to suppress certain statements, while the prosecution argued for their inclusion based on established legal standards. In capital cases like this, these pretrial arguments can be decisive, influencing how the jury interprets the case and what evidence is ultimately available for deliberation. The trial itself was held in a court in South Carolina, with both the prosecution and defense presenting extensive evidence and testimony. Expert witnesses played an important role, providing analysis of forensic findings, behavioral assessments, and context for the events that transpired. Jurors were tasked with the difficult responsibility of weighing this information impartially, balancing the gravity of the alleged crime against the standards of law and justice. Throughout the trial, the atmosphere was tense but procedural, as the courtroom became a microcosm of the legal system's attempt to navigate a profoundly consequential case. Opening statements outlined the stakes. The prosecution emphasized the severity of the offense, the societal need for accountability, and the necessity of a sentence that reflected the ultimate seriousness of the act. The defense, conversely, highlighted Bowman's background, the influence of his environment and circumstances, and argued for consideration of mitigating factors. These early statements set the tone for a trial in which both sides presented compelling narratives supported by testimony, documents, and forensic analysis. Witness testimony formed a central part of the proceedings. Individuals who had observed aspects of the incident, neighbors who noticed unusual activity, and experts who analyzed physical evidence all contributed to the narrative presented to the jury. Some witnesses were challenged on cross-examination, and their credibility became a crucial factor in determining the weight of their accounts. The legal teams carefully navigated procedural rules, ensuring that objections were raised and addressed according to courtroom protocol. Forensic evidence included items recovered from the scene, records of communication, and materials analyzed by crime laboratories. While modern media often sensationalizes such details, the focus in this case was on establishing a factual and legally defensible connection between the accused and the events in question. The jury was presented with exhibits, expert testimony, and reports in a structured manner designed to allow for an objective evaluation of the facts. During closing arguments, both sides summarized their positions and appealed to the jurors' sense of responsibility. The prosecution emphasized accountability, justice for the victim, and societal expectations. The defense urged careful consideration of all mitigating circumstances, highlighting aspects of Marion Bowman Jr.'s upbringing, social environment, and personal history that they argued were relevant to sentencing. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that reflected the severity of the charges. Marion Bowman Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to death, a decision that would carry implications not only for him, but for the state's handling of capital punishment cases in subsequent years. This verdict set in motion decades of appeals, procedural reviews, and legal challenges, as the case became emblematic of the broader debates surrounding the death penalty in the United States. It is critical to note that the focus here is on the process, procedure, and the legal framework, not on graphic details of the crime itself. This approach allows us to understand the gravity of the case, the thoroughness of the investigation, and the complexity of the trial, while maintaining respect for everyone involved and adhering to documentary ethics. The Bowman case, like many capital cases, highlights the intersection of human decision-making, legal procedure, and societal expectations. From the initial investigation through trial and sentencing, every action taken reflects the seriousness of imposing the ultimate penalty. The case also underscores the challenges inherent in balancing factual accuracy, fairness, and the irreversible consequences of a death sentence. By the end of the trial, Marion Bowman Jr. was formally sentenced to death. What followed was a period of prolonged legal review, appeals, stays of execution, and procedural challenges that would occupy years of his life and the attention of courts and legal scholars alike. The verdict was not the end of the story, but rather a turning point in a larger narrative that spans decades, encompassing legal, social, and personal dimensions. As we conclude this part of the story, we are left with a sense of the weight of legal responsibility, the thoroughness of investigative work, and the solemnity of the courtroom process. The trial of Marion Bowman Jr. demonstrates how the American justice system attempts to navigate complex cases, balancing the need for accountability with the demands of due process. What comes next is a look into the long years on death row, the appeals process, and the ongoing debates that defined his path until the final chapter of his life. A death sentence isn't just a single moment in a courtroom. It's the beginning of a story that can last for decades. For Marion Bowman Jr., the gavel's fall marked the start of a journey not toward freedom, but deep into the heart of the American justice system, a world defined by confinement, constant legal battles, and the ever-present shadow of his own mortality. This is the story of what happens after the verdict, the long, winding road of life on death row. Welcome to Death Row. It's a world apart from the rest of the prison system, a place that reveals so much about the complexities of crime and punishment. In South Carolina, where Marion Bowman was held, death row means maximum security. We're talking about small, confined cells, severely restricted movement, and every single interaction meticulously monitored. For Bowman, life became a rigid routine dictated by the prison, a cycle broken only by legal meetings, family visits, and the immense psychological weight of living under the ultimate sentence. From the very moment the sentence was made official, Bowman's legal team launched into the appeals process. In capital cases, appeals aren't just an option, they're often mandatory. This reflects the immense gravity of the death penalty, the fact that once a life is taken, there's no going back. His attorneys dug into everything. They challenged procedural errors from the trial, re-examined every piece of evidence, and questioned any aspect that might have unfairly influenced the jury's decision. Each appeal wasn't just a tactic to delay the execution. It was a desperate search for justice within a system that, at least on paper, acknowledges the incredible stakes involved. The appeals process for Bowman, like for so many on death row, was a long and tangled maze. It moved from state courts to federal courts, and at times, even reached the steps of the Supreme Court. Each level of the judiciary examined a different piece of the puzzle. Was the trial fair? Was the evidence handled correctly? Did his lawyers provide an adequate defense? Judges would issue their rulings, sometimes upholding the conviction, other times sending the case back for another look. They'd grant stays of execution, pausing the clock to allow for a deeper investigation. This created a life lived in limbo, a constant state of suspension between the certainty of death and the uncertainty of a legal reprieve. Every ruling brought either a wave of temporary relief or a crushing return of tension. Over the years, public attention on Bowman's case came and went in waves. For those pushing to reform the death penalty, his case became a prime example. They used it to fuel broader debates about fairness, about racial disparities in sentencing, and about the terrifying possibility of executing an innocent person. Critics of capital punishment pointed to the prolonged psychological torture experienced by inmates on death row. They raised ethical questions about the methods of execution and highlighted how justice often seemed to be applied unevenly from one community to another. These weren't just quiet conversations. They played out in newspapers, in legal journals, and in academic debates, placing Bowman's personal story at the center of a much larger national conversation. Inside the prison walls, Marion Bowman lived the human reality of death row. The isolation is profound. Social interaction is minimal. And there's the constant, gnawing awareness that your life isn't measured in years or months, but in appeals and legal deadlines. Letters from family, visits through thick glass, and conversations with his legal team became lifelines, anchors in a world deliberately designed to restrict and confine. Accounts from his lawyers and others who knew him suggest that Bowman fought to maintain his dignity, to create a sense of routine within the chaos. It's a testament to human resilience in a situation that most of us would find psychologically unbearable. Many of Bowman's appeals centered on issues that would later become defining arguments about fairness and due process in South Carolina. His lawyers questioned if the jury selection had been biased, ensuring a fair and impartial group of his peers. They challenged whether critical evidence had been properly handled and presented. And they argued that mitigating circumstances from his difficult early life hadn't been given enough weight during the sentencing phase. Each of these legal maneuvers required mountains of paperwork, meticulous preparation, and a strategic courtroom presentation. The judges who heard these arguments had to weigh them with incredible care, knowing that it wasn't just one man's life on the line. but the very credibility of the justice system itself. Beyond the courtroom, there were other forces at play. State officials were constantly reviewing and debating execution protocols. There were fierce arguments over the ethical use of certain lethal injection drugs, and legal challenges to the timing and methods of execution were common. Nationwide shortages of these drugs and constitutional questions about whether they constituted cruel and unusual punishment created a chaotic environment. This backdrop of administrative and political conflict directly impacted Bowman's case. Several times, stays of execution were issued not because of a breakthrough in his case, but because of these larger, systemic problems, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to his already precarious existence. Throughout these decades, Bowman's case was a recurring reference point in the national debate over capital punishment. Reform advocates would point to his endless appeals as proof that the system was broken, too slow, and dangerously prone to error. Lawmakers and legal scholars debated whether keeping someone on death row for decades was, in itself, a form of cruel and unusual punishment. His case came to symbolize the deep tension in our society, the public's demand for accountability and swift justice on one hand, and the absolute necessity of a fair, thorough, and just legal process on the other. It's impossible to overstate the psychological toll of this existence. Imagine living every day with the knowledge of your own scheduled death, trapped in isolation, with your future hanging on the thread of legal decisions you have no control over. Bowman's own letters, court filings, and the few interviews he gave paint a picture of a man trying to navigate this impossible landscape with a mix of pragmatism and deep reflection. The crushing monotony of daily routines, the anxiety of waiting for a court's decision, and the heavy, psychological weight of it all. This was the reality of a life defined not by personal freedom, but by the rigid, inflexible machinery of the legal and penal systems. Over the years, the legal outcomes were a roller coaster. His sentence was affirmed multiple times, only to be followed by temporary stays of execution granted by higher courts. Each decision, whether good or bad for his case, was picked up by local and national media, weaving his personal story into a larger societal narrative. For those watching from the outside, Bowman's case was a masterclass in the complexities of appellate law. It highlighted the immense challenge of balancing due process with the desire for finality, and it forced people to confront the societal implications of executing someone after they've already spent decades in confinement. While the public often focuses on the final, dramatic act of an execution, the years, and in Bowman's case, the decades, leading up to it are a story in themselves. They are filled with intense legal negotiations, tireless advocacy, and the careful, painstaking application of legal principles. Bowman's appeals shine a light on both the procedural rigor and the deep ethical complexities baked into the death penalty system. They also show us the human side of the law, where attorneys, judges, and advocates grapple with the moral weight of decisions that carry the irreversible consequence of ending a human life. In the end, Marion Bowman Jr.'s time on death row was anything but passive. It was a period defined by relentless legal strategy, quiet personal reflection, and intense public scrutiny. His story is a powerful reminder that the impact of a death sentence is never instantaneous. It ripples across time, profoundly affecting the inmate, the victim's family, the legal community, and society as a whole. As we look at Bowman's life, poised at the threshold of his final years, we see a fate shaped by decades of legal battles and societal debate. What comes next is the final chapter, the culmination of a journey that began long before the courtroom and stretched across a lifetime of challenge, reflection, and review. The end of Marion Bowman Jr.'s life didn't arrive in an instant. It was the slow, drawn-out conclusion to more than 2 decades spent on South Carolina's death row. Those years were a relentless cycle of legal battles, appeals, debates, and a heavy, constant uncertainty. On January 31st, 2025, that final chapter closed. It didn't end with a judge's gavel, but with a final, somber act witnessed by a handful of people, documented by official statements, and carried out by the authority of the state. Just hours before his scheduled execution, a final meal was prepared for him. This is a long-standing tradition in many places, allowing condemned inmates one last choice from an approved menu. Marion Bowman Jr.'s request was substantial. It seemed to reflect more than just physical hunger. Perhaps it was a human instinct to reach for some small comfort in the final hours. He asked for fried shrimp, fried fish, oysters, chicken wings, chicken tenders, and onion rings. For dessert, he had banana pudding and German chocolate cake. To drink, he requested pineapple and cranberry juices. There's a strange paradox in this moment. A man condemned for taking a life, yet granted a moment of choice over life's simple pleasures. The public often finds these last meals fascinating. They're a stark reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, people cling to familiar tastes and small comforts before facing the great unknown. But as notable as the final meal was, it wasn't what made the end of Marion Bowman Jr.'s story truly remarkable. What captured attention, making headlines in legal journals and news outlets, was his final statement. It was a carefully composed reflection, released through his attorney and read aloud shortly before the execution. This wasn't just a few shouted last words. Bowman's statement was expansive and reflective. He started by asserting what he had claimed throughout his entire imprisonment. "I did not kill Candy Martin." This was the same refrain he had voiced in countless appeals, legal filings, and interviews. Even with his end just moments away, he wanted to leave one last record of his claimed innocence, arguing that his conviction was flawed and that his legal representation had been inadequate. But his statement didn't just focus on himself. In a poignant turn, he acknowledged the profound pain of the victim's family. He recognized the depth of the loss they had endured. "I know that Candy's family is in pain. They are justifiably angry," Bowman stated. He then added that if his death could somehow offer them relief and ability to focus on the good times and funny stories, then maybe his execution had served a purpose. This acknowledgement, a mix of apology and acquiescence, was followed by an appeal for peace. Bowman expressed a hope that Candy's loved ones might one day find some form of closure. It was a remarkable sentiment from a man whose trial and sentence had become entangled in a much larger national conversation. The execution itself took place at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. Bowman was led into the execution chamber in the early evening. The entire system, the courts, the prison officials, and the state government, had denied all requests for clemency. Every legal avenue had been exhausted right up to the last moment. Both the South Supreme Court and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals had declined to intervene, and the state's governor denied clemency, despite petitions submitted on Bowman's behalf. At approximately 6:27 p.m., after a lethal injection of pentobarbital was administered, Marion Bowman Jr. was pronounced dead by medical personnel. This made him the first person to be executed in the United States in the year 2025. The method of execution, lethal injection with pentobarbital, was more than just a procedural detail. For years, South Carolina had been forced to pause executions because it couldn't obtain the necessary drugs. However, new state laws were passed to shield the identities of drug suppliers, which allowed executions to resume after a 13-year hiatus. Bowman's execution was therefore part of a larger, renewed pattern of capital punishment in the state, with more executions scheduled to follow. In the hours and days that followed, reactions poured in from all sides. Some commentators viewed his execution as justice finally being served, pointing to the gravity of the crime for which he had been convicted. Others, however, criticized the entire process. Their arguments ranged from concerns about potential racial bias in his sentencing to questions about the evidence used to convict him and the ethical implications of resuming executions with new, secretive lethal injection protocols. Bowman's execution reignited several contentious debates. Advocacy groups argued that the justice system had failed him. They highlighted a critical aspect of his trial. Trusted family members and acquaintances had testified against him in exchange for plea deals. His attorneys had long argued this was a deeply problematic foundation for a conviction. Critics also pointed to the extreme length of time he spent on death row and raised ongoing concerns about whether the legal system adequately accounts for racial inequities and the devastating impact of ineffective legal counsel. Beyond the legal arguments, broader discussions emerged about the psychological toll of life on death row, especially in the final months leading up to an execution. Observers noted that Bowman, like many condemned inmates, had spent long periods in solitary confinement. Many advocates describe this practice as a form of extreme isolation that is profoundly harmful to mental well-being. The case of Marion Bowman Jr. has left behind multiple legacies. In the court of public opinion, it has become a flashpoint for debates about the fairness of capital punishment and the reliability of testimonies obtained through plea bargains. In the legal community, it has raised sharp questions about the appellate review process, prosecutorial conduct, and the evolving standards that should govern death penalty cases. And within our broader culture, his story has become a significant chapter in the ongoing conversation about whether the death penalty should even remain a part of the American legal system. The final moments of Marion Bowman Jr.'s life were legally definitive, but they were also humanly complex. They were a mixture of denial, acknowledgement, a hope for peace for others, and an acceptance of an irreversible fate. His life story, from his childhood through his conviction and all the way to his execution, is now a documented piece of American justice history. It's a piece that will continue to be analyzed, contested, and remembered in many different contexts for years to come. The death of Marion Bowman Jr. doesn't end the conversation about capital punishment in the United States. Instead, it pushes that conversation forward, forcing all of us to grapple with difficult questions that have no simple answers. Questions about justice, about accountability, and about what it truly means for a nation to hold the power to decide who lives and who dies. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think, please consider subscribing for more in-depth content.